We moved here from Phoenix, and one of the things that struck us almost immediately about Nob Hill and about this particular neighborhood right here was how friendly it was, and how we met more people on our block in the first week that we lived here than I think we did the entire time we lived in Tempe and Phoenix. Well, our first house was interesting because there was the house that we ended up buying was Ruby's house. Ruby actually owned, and I can't remember Ruby's last name, but Ruby owned two houses. And so Ruby lived in the house that we bought, and her husband apparently lived in the house across the street. And the neighbors said that she would go over and have breakfast with him every morning. And so, you know, it kind of took that separate bedroom thing the next level, I guess, at that time. And Ruby apparently wasn't a very nice person, according to the neighbors. So we heard a lot of stories about Ruby, and she had a little bit of a reputation.
I was living in a house in Summit Park and walking through Nob Hill every day to work. And after we'd been doing that for about a year, I was walking by this house one day. As a matter of fact, I walked down this street almost every day to work. And some neighbors were out in the driveway with the person that owned this house, and they were talking. And as I came by, one of them looked over at me and she said, "Why don't you buy this house? It's for sale." And before I could answer, she said, "Wait, are you a Democrat?" And and so I didn't quite know how to answer that, but it sort of planted the seed. We hadn't really thought of buying a house in Albuquerque. We were actually looking in Santa Fe and up around Taos and other places in New Mexico. But I guess she planted the seed, and being a Democratic person, we ended up buying this house. And it turned out to be a great neighborhood. What we love about it is the diversity. We have people with toddlers, with teenagers, we have grandmothers and great-grandmothers, and people of all ages live here. I love everything about it. I love the diversity, the controversy. I even like the parts that are kind of gritty and seedy and weedy.
From Ouray, Colorado, I was supposed to go north to Shirley Basin in Wyoming to get a job as a miner there, but I got screwed up. I ended up in Grants because I don't know south from north or my left from right. I don't know my left from right. You'd say go left. I was miserable in the Army. When I was a pointman, it'd say left, I went right, and then I'd have the whole platoon smother at me and say, "Hey, shrimp, get out of the way." One day he walked by with his dog Brenda, English setter, and I saw him or talked to him, and then all of a sudden I see Brenda, the dog, running up and down the block, and Mrs. Sousa is up there, "Brenda, Brenda, Brenda, Brenda," and Brenda is running from this stop sign to this stop sign. It just goes on and on and on. And Mrs. Sousa, she never did express too much. She was so very shy. But Brenda, Brenda, Brenda. So she ends up chasing Brenda all the way up to the stop sign. Meanwhile, I would go see Clarence to tell him no, that his dog is out. And he comes out, stands over there, and his wife is chasing Brenda, and he's still standing there, and we staying there, and Mrs. Sousa's chasing the dog. And I looked at him and said, "That's not Brenda." Mr. Regener had a black student, a male, and two girls living in that apartment that he built. And one day the black fellow, it was a nice day, they came and the two girls sat in the front there and they were just talking. And Mr. Marovka saw that and he didn't like it because his wife was from Mississippi or Missouri, and immediately they gathered a whole bunch of them, four of them, Fred Miller, Mr. Wink, and they were going to have, and Mrs. Marovka went over to Dr. Reagan and said, "You should be ashamed to have a black man and two white women living under your roof." And he just told it to go off. Frank Kite. He worked at Sandia as an engineer or something. But he was a good neighbor. At that time, I had decided to repair my truck, the motor of my truck. I took it apart, and I couldn't. After I put it together, it wouldn't start. He kept trying to start, and Mr. Kite and Mr. Wing were sitting on a porch there, watching me. We were friends. I mean, I would talk to them, but I didn't know that he was a mechanic. And anyway, I was trying to get my truck to kick and start, and wouldn't, and it went on, I guess, for a day. And Mr. Kite and Mr. Wing was sitting, and finally I said to Mr. Wink one morning, I can't get that started. He said, "Well, why don't you ask Frank Kite?" So I went and knocked on the door, and he said, I said, "Mr. Kite, I can't get my trucks to kick in and start." He said, "Well, all you have to do is take your wrench and back up a quarter of an inch on the screw on your valves, on top of the valves. You didn't ask? I didn't tell you. You asking me? I'm telling you." So I came and I did a quarter of an inch 16 times. Went in there. These were the guys, if you didn't ask, then they only socialize with you when either they liked you or didn't like you. They liked me, but I didn't make the move to be, well, anyway.
Little known fact about my house on Carlisle, southeast there. Cesar Chavez slept there one night.
Who was that?
Cesar Chavez
Yeah?
slept there.
Oh.
During the boycott years, we were a stopping place for the people coming from California going back east. They would be a carload of workers, and they would just call in the afternoon and say, "We're coming through Albuquerque, can we stay overnight?" And so we were set up as one of the houses where they could do that. And then a couple of us were thinking, well, we should get Chavez to come and speak in Albuquerque. And so the first time he came to Albuquerque, we brought him in, and we asked him about hotels, and he said, "Oh, what if you take the money you spend on a hotel and just give it to the union, and I'll sleep at somebody's house." So he slept at my house. And the night he arrived, we had a small reception of people who had donated to help bring him, and Reyes Tijerina showed up, and so it's also where Chavez met Tijerina for the first time. His schedule was to speak at Rio Grande, then go to the Alianza, then catch this flight. So driving back from Santa Fe, he's saying, "Oh, if we could get back to your house and I could take a nap, that would be so good, because I'm really wiped out." And we're driving back, I-25, this was 67 in the winter. There wasn't a freeway. Remember, you could just drive off of the highway to go to Santo Domingo. There was just like a regular turnoff. Before us in the distance, we could see a bus. And the bus dropped off, who was obviously an elderly Indian man, and he got off the bus and started walking down that road, and we go flashing by. And he said, well, where's that guy going? I said, well, he's probably going to Santo Domingo. And he said, how far is that? Well, it's probably 5 miles or so down that road, or 3 miles. And he was silent for a few minutes, and I said, you want to go back for him, don't you? He said, yes. So we turned around, went back, picked up that Indian guy, and drove him down to Santo Domingo. And they were, I didn't speak Spanish, and at those days I didn't really understand that much. They were talking in Spanish, and then it turned out that he invited Chavez to his house to come in and, you know, have a drink. And so by the time we got back to my house, we had to go right to Rio Grande. So he missed his nap to pick up this elderly guy. And I thought, wow, it shows, you know, where his heart is.
We had a neighbor in your block, in the 500 block, Clarence Sousa.
Yeah.
And Clarence he made jewelry. He was Native American. He made really nice jewelry, and he'd always sit on his front porch and he'd chat with us when we walked by. And then he died. And I felt so sad that he died. So I organized a little memorial service in the front yard. We just took some lawn chairs and sat in his front yard, and everybody talked about what they remembered about Clarence. And I think that might have been the first time I sort of got to know you better. And Mary and Catherine came to that. Bill came to that. I can't remember who else came to that, but
There were a lot of people there.
there were maybe 8 of us just sitting in the front yard in lawn chairs, sort of reminiscing about Clarence. We don't have any bees anymore, and that makes me very, very sad. We do, however, have chickens. And Nob Hill apparently has a lot of chickens, backyard chickens.
Yeah.
And Henry has chickens, we have chickens, several other neighbors have chickens. Our friend in the South Valley brought us 2 fertilized eggs, and those eggs hatched and turned into roosters. And, you know, there's a noise ordinance in Nob Hill. Anyway, so I sent out an email to all my neighbors. I have an email listserv, and I said, look, this was kind of a mistake. We didn't mean to get roosters, and they're really noisy. They were crowing, you know, every 2 minutes from 5 o'clock in the morning on. Anyway, I sent out this email, and I said, if our roosters are bothering you, please, you know, let us know immediately. And like within 24 hours, I got back, I think, 12 responses. And they all said pretty much the same thing. They all said pretty much, your roosters are not only not bothering us, but we like the sound of your roosters, which was kind of a surprise. And Henry's got a rooster.
Yeah, rooster, peacock.
I'd had an intern who had worked with me who had gone to UNM and said if he ever could get back to Albuquerque, he was going. He loved it out here. So I remembered that when I saw that Emmanuel Presbyterian Church was open. Came out here and just fell in love with the landscape. It was so different from anything I'd ever really been a part of or had experience with. Happened to come out on the weekend of the Gathering of Nations with all the Native American communities represented and in town, and flew back. As we were flying back, our first leg at least was next to a couple of Native American women speaking their language that just kind of fascinated me. So I thought this, you know, the idea that popped in my head was this would be my cowboy adventure to come out to Albuquerque. I had a guy come in yesterday, an hour before our services, and got a cup of coffee and fell asleep in the chair. And so we just let him sleep, because that was obviously what he needed to do. I wondered if people in the neighborhood, you know, how they felt about bells going off all the time.
I like
and
them. But I grew up with bells. When
and
I go to my grandfather's.
I've not heard a single complaint. I've asked specifically, what do you think of the bells? And they say, oh, you know, whatever you do, don't get rid of the bells. So I'm glad to hear that.
One of the things I've found being on North Amherst is that everybody comes over and they want to meet you. And they say, let's be pals. You're going to be part of our community. Let's get acquainted.
I've really enjoyed some of the people that I've known in Nob Hill. We had a neighbor on Carlisle for a long time named Vern LaCour. Vern was called the Old Cajun. Vern wore bib overalls every day. And he carried a little $3 bill right here. And he had a constant garage sale. He had a constant flea market out in his front yard. He would sell eggs and chickens and then rabbits and chicken coops. Every Halloween he'd get a flatbed trailer loaded with pumpkins and he'd sell those. Well, he was in an R1 lot on Carlisle, and I'm not sure about the zoning ordinances, but I think you're allowed to have maybe 2 garage sales per year. But Vern had 365 garage sales a year. And it was really fun to go over there. And if you'd buy something and you had some change coming, he'd always try and give you a $3 bill for your change. He was really funny. And there would occasionally be a zoning complaint. I heard, I didn't ever get involved in it, but the zoning people would come out and they'd say, well, how many garage sales have you had this year, sir? And he'd say, oh, only a couple. I can't remember, not very many. And I don't think they ever did accomplish anything as far as slowing down his garage sales. But we got to know him and we really liked him. And he told me once that he lived on Carlisle by Grand, and he had worked for some 30 years for a man named Stanley Zafansky, who owned the Sinclair station. At one time, when this was Route 66, there must have been 20 gas stations just within what we call Nob Hill. A lot of them are gone now. A lot of them have been changed, like the Jones Motor Company, which has been changed to a nice restaurant and a brew pub. And there was the Chevron station at Carlisle and Central, which is now Fantang, and across Carlisle from that is the 1936 Conoco station. Used to say Nob Hill Station up above. And that's vacant at the moment because the Golden Eagle shut down, but it will be something nice before too long. So Vern worked for Stanley Zafansky at the Sinclair station at the corner of Central and Hermosa, which is now the Planned Parenthood. And he told me once that there was a gate in his backyard, and I said, why is that gate there? And he said, well, that goes through my sister-in-law's backyard, and every morning I would go through there and then go down Hermosa to my work, and I'd pump gas all day. That was when you pumped, the filling station pumped the gas, not you. And then I suppose they would check your oil and wash your windshield. And then he said at noon I would walk up Hermosa, it's just a block, through my sister-in-law's yard, through that gate and into my backyard, and I'd have lunch with my wife, and then I'd go back and for the afternoon shift. Vern was a good-hearted guy. One time we did buy a goose egg from him, and Melody ate that. I'm not sure why, but she was violently ill for at least 72 hours after that. And after that, she found it hard to ever go to visit Vern because she'd start feeling pretty queasy. we went in and he showed us the eggs. He just stored them on a double bed in a bedroom. So maybe that's why the goose eggs weren't really so good for you. Melody and I came to Nob Hill about 22 years ago, and we had a little house on Solano Drive, North Solano Drive. When we moved in there, this man came over, and he said, he had an odd voice. He said, "My name is Theodore Knight." And I thought, wow, that's an interesting guy. I got to meet him. So we got to know Theodore. He was also called Ted, and he lived on North Solano, and he had been there, I guess, for 40 or 50 years. Theodore used to work for the bank. He was a worker in the bank. He sang opera, and I think when he sang opera, it kind of injured his voice. So he sort of had a wavering voice like that. Well, anyway, there were things that Theodore didn't like, and one was when people would speed through the neighborhood in their car. The speed limit's 25, and people would often go, and they still go 30, 35, as fast as they want, really. And one day, Theodore was out watering his lawn with the hose, and a car went by real fast, and he got mad and he just sprayed that car with a hose. And the car continued up the street, and then about 5 minutes later, here came a young woman and her boyfriend. And he was a big old boyfriend, and Ted was a little old man, and the boyfriend said, "I hear you sprayed my girlfriend's car. I don't like that." And Theodore said, "Well, she was speeding on our street, and I don't like that." And there was a police substation down at the 7-Eleven, and the boyfriend said, "Well, I'm going to go get the police, and we'll figure this out." And Theodore said, "Well, you just go down there and tell them that you're having trouble with Judge Knight." And the boyfriend said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, Your Honor. I didn't know you were a judge." And they ran off, but Ted wasn't a judge at all. But that's how he took care of that problem.
My dad grew up in Southern California, and he studied architecture and engineering in Southern California, and he came to New Mexico earlier, sometime around 1927. My dad's name was Gordon Ferguson. I think he had seen a little post-it at his school for a job here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so that's how he ended up here. In 1945, my dad designed a small office for himself and his growing business at 111 Amherst Drive, Southeast, and it was completed in 1946. My mom kept a scrapbook of a lot of my dad's buildings, and this was in the she even wrote Albuquerque Journal, 9/23/45, architect builds own office. In elementary school, I would take the city bus after school from Manzano Day School, past through downtown and up Central Avenue, and I'd get off at Amherst and walk up to the office to wait for my dad. I'd get off at Amherst and walk up to the office to wait for my dad, and my favorite thing to do was to go to the back drafting room, crawl up on a stool, and watch George Pearl draw plans for some building. And he was an amazing man, a complete gentleman. He always called me Susan.
Gordon actually started it maybe before World War II. We're talking like 44, 45.
It
so
could be.
We're thinking that we're at our 70th year this year.
I guess I was here probably 45 years, and he was here 35, you say, or something like
yeah,
that.
34 so far, yeah.
There was a feeling of, or an attitude of don't hire and fire, but you keep the good people as long as you can, even through times when there wasn't much work. I remember there were times in the original office when the firm got down to Gordon Ferguson, Don Stevens, George Pearl, and myself. George and I were the only two people in the drafting room, and we didn't have anything to do, so we painted the drafting room.
And we really needed parking space. Everybody's trying to park on the streets and everything. So, knowing Pauline, I approached her. I said, would you be interested in selling that lot or leasing it to us? We'd like to buy it. And she said, well, I will consider it. Mm. So she came back with a figure, and I think it was $70,000. And I said, I'll take it, just right off the bat. And she said, well, I'll work on it here. And a couple of weeks later, I hadn't heard from her. And she came back, she called back, and she said, I've reconsidered this. I need a little bit more for that. And I said, well, what's your price now, Pauline? And she said, $85,000. I'll take it. And I don't know what the lot is worth now, but it's worth a hell of a lot more than $85,000.
There was a bakery across the street.
At Gecko's.
Gecko's.
That where Gecko's is now.
Okay.
That I think was run by a women's church group or somebody that was really tied in that way. But this every morning somebody from here would run across the street, buy a bunch of rolls and donuts and bring it back.
He's still doing that when I came. And
Still?
then Dell Dickinson would open the door and whistle into the back drafting room. That would mean it's break time.
Right.
Off we came.
Yeah.
We kept that bakery going for a long time. Shop is right in the corner. There used to be an ice cream shop in there. And I think we all put on a lot of weight between the bakery and the ice cream shop. And then we would go over to Baca's restaurant.
Oh yeah.
That was over here on the north side of Central.
It was either Baca's or Goody's or the Townhouse.
Yeah.
I remember one guy in our office had sat for his architectural examination several times and had not passed. And at the time, Bob Mallory was actually on the state board, and so there was some state board stationery hanging around. And the guy finally passed when you got his letter, and he was showing it around and stuff. And somebody got it in their head a couple days later to write him another letter saying that they'd made a mistake. And he didn't pass with a 76, it was really a 67.
The Dienzas, of course, been in the news the last few years.
Yeah.
But I have to share that the first night we were married, we spent at the Dienza.
Yeah.
1969.
How was the Dianza at that time?
I don't remember. I guess it was good.
At the, I don't know what they call it, used to be Mesa del Sol. And we were waiting for the concert to begin, and we were hungry, so we went and sat at this long table, and we were eating, I don't know, something, hot dogs or something, a bowl of chili. And there was a guy sitting down from me at the table, and we started talking, and he said, we were talking about Bob Dylan and where we'd seen him before and things like that, and then he said, oh, I loved going to concerts at the Civic Auditorium. He said, such a great place. And he said, that building was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And I said, no, it wasn't. It was designed by my dad. And I've never had somebody look at me before like he was looking at a chronic liar.
Why did the firm stay on Amherst all these years?
Well, we've looked at options, other options, and considered, at times we thought maybe we were expanding to the point where we really ought to find a new place. And, we went out and did a couple of searches a couple of times.
Serious searches.
Serious searches, looked at some opportunities out there. And, the staff here were always of the opinion that they'd rather stay here.
Strongly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
And
people
so
objected.
we listened.
Yeah, they
we
objected.
we really listened and really felt like, we could make this work. We looked at adding a floor, and we've looked at some other options here, but it's been a good place for us all to be here all this time.
Right.